This video is sponsored by Squarespace. The river winds through a canyon, at times more than 1,000 feet from top to bottom. But unlike the canyons of the West, its walls are made not of earth and rock, but of glass and steel, a man-made wonder showcasing some of the most famous buildings in the world. The birthplace of the skyscraper itself. It's a town that, sitting in one of the most strategically placed locations in the country, rose from actual ashes to become among the largest and most iconic cities in the world, an essential conduit for global commerce, transportation, and culture. A classic American metropolis that today is the largest U.S. city in the country's interior. But Illinois is far from just Chicago. It's home to vast stretches of productive farmland, wide and mighty rivers, and unglaciated pockets of hills and forests. Numerous other smaller cities help make it one of the most populous states in the country. While mostly in the Midwest, Illinois is a large state, and its southern tip is culturally more a part of the South. Regionally and culturally diverse and home to a huge population, Illinois has long played a leading role in the history, society, and culture of the United States. It's a unique and fascinating state, and the 21st place I will cover in the U.S. Explained, a 56-part series on every state, territory, and federal district in the country by order of admission. Hello and welcome to That Is Interesting. I'm your host Carter. This is the U.S. Explained, episode 22, Illinois. If you're trying to start a blog, a newsletter, or an online business, having a nice professional looking website will give you a lot of credibility. Today's sponsor, Squarespace, makes creating your own website easy and simple. Recently, I've been working on building my own website to complement this channel, and Squarespace has been super user friendly and honestly a really fun experience. In this day and age, having your own website can be really useful. Anything from starting your own small business, looking to raise money for a cause that's important to you, or documenting your travels will be made so much easier with a website. And with Squarespace, you can build your own website with your own domain that looks personalized and professional. Do you want to teach an online course? Their member areas feature allows you to earn extra income doing just that. Want to send emails directly to your customers? Start your own blog? Collect donations? All that and more is easily doable with Squarespace. And you can link it to your other social media sites, as well as use their great analytics tools to see just how much traffic your site is getting. The best part is, I've got a special deal on Squarespace just for you. Head to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/thatisinteresting to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain using code THATISINTERESTING. Illinois is divided primarily into two climate zones, with the divide roughly in the center of the state. Its northern half is situated in the hot summer humid continental zone, with 4 distinct seasons, hot summers and cold winters, except for a few areas near the border with Wisconsin in the cooler, warm summer humid continental zone. The southern half of the state is warmer, sitting in the humid subtropical climate zone, with hot summers, mild winters, and high humidity. It sits at 30th out of the 50 states in terms of rainfall, getting 38.52 inches of precipitation on average each year. It's also about in the middle in terms of temperature. Its average temperature of 51.37 degrees Fahrenheit or 10.76 degrees Celsius, placing it at 26th out of the 50 states. It's the Midwest, so it will get some pretty cold winters, especially up north. Chicago is famously nicknamed the Windy City, but it's not actually due to the city's weather. Originally, it was a crack at the city's politicians, who the Cincinnati Enquirer once wrote were full of wind. It is a pretty windy city though, the 12th windiest major city in the country on average, so you can see why the nickname stuck. The entire state is located in the central time zone. Illinois is nicknamed the Land of Lincoln, for arguably the most famous Illinoisan, President Abraham Lincoln, who was born in Kentucky but lived and built his political career out of the state. Another nickname you'll hear is the Prairie State, for the wide expanses of flat prairie land that allowed it to become one of the most agriculturally productive states in the U.S. The name of the state comes from the Illinois River, which flows through it in its entirety. The river's name, though, is one that was translated again and again across a number of different languages. It originates from a confederation of around a dozen native peoples who lived in the region. They made up a number of different ethnic groups, but spoke a common language and collectively called themselves the Anoka. Their word for the speakers of their language was Irinwewa. The Ojibwe native people group of the upper Midwest then translated Irinwewa as Iliniwek, and when the French arrived in the region, they they pronounced the Ojibwe word Illiniwek as Illinois, which later American settlers then pronounced Illinois. Because of this, the Anoka were often referred to as the Illinois Confederation, and the name was later given to the river and then the state that sat on their homeland. Illinois' flag shows the main design of its state seal on a white background with the word Illinois written underneath. It shows an eagle perched on a shield with an American flag design, as well as a rock with the years 1868, when the seal design was made, and 1818, when Illinois became a state. It's carrying a banner that reads State Sovereignty, National Union. As state flags go, I think the design of just using the seal is pretty played out and makes it difficult to tell what's going on. On the other hand, the white background is a bit more distinguishable from a lot of the other state seal designs, which mostly use dark blue backgrounds. One flag that is really popular is the flag of Chicago, which has a really nice design and you'll see on clothes, brands, and just flying in general throughout the city. In my opinion, it's one of the best city flags in the US, and Chicagoans tend to be really proud of it. Illinois is almost exactly in the middle of the states in terms of land area, at 24th out of 50, taking up 55,518 square miles, or 143,793 square kilometers. It's slightly larger than its neighbor to the north, Wisconsin, and slightly smaller than another neighboring state, Iowa. Overall, it's a similar size to most of its neighbors. In terms of population, however, Illinois is among the top tier of largest states in the country. 12.8 million people live in the land of Lincoln, more than any other state besides California, Texas, Florida, New York, and Pennsylvania. This is largely due to the presence of Chicago, the third most populous urban area, as well as the third most populous city altogether in the United States. The city and its suburbs are home to 8.67 million people, and although they stretch into neighboring Indiana and Wisconsin as well, most of the greater area known as Chicagoland's residents live in Illinois. About 8.3 million Illinoisans, or 65% of the state's population, live either in Chicago or the city's suburbs within the state. It's a pretty large state, however, and the remaining 4.5 million people are spread throughout a number of smaller cities, suburban areas, and small towns. Like much of the Midwest, abundant water, food, and flat land that's both well suited for agriculture and easy to settle has given rural Illinois a large population. Smaller cities as well as small towns fill pretty much the entire state. And even if you live in a rural area, you're likely never more than a few minutes drive from a nearby town, and your closest neighbors probably aren't too far away either. Taking up a fairly large area but also home to a huge population, Illinois is on the higher side in terms of population density, with the 12th highest population density of any state in the country at 231 people per square mile, or 89 per square kilometer. That's a slightly smaller population density than California and a slightly larger density than Hawaii. Because Chicago and its suburbs are home to so many people and take up such an enormous proportion of the state's population, there's a major cultural divide between the city and the rest of the state, sometimes known as downstate Illinois, though this is a term that some people from the region don't like. Chicago's huge population means that city politicians typically dominate state elections, and the government, fairly or not, is perceived as focusing a disproportionate amount of their attention and funds on the city, a perception not helped by the fact that two recent state governors refused to move from Chicago to the capital city of Springfield after being elected. On top of that, most of rural Illinois is politically conservative, whereas the majority of Illinoisans living in or around the city are politically liberal, adding an element of political division to the already existing cultural divide between city and country. Chicago is known as a primate city, a city that takes up a much larger share of its state or country's population than any other. Other heavily populated states such as California, Texas, Florida, and Pennsylvania are each home to multiple major cities that have somewhat similar populations to one another, meaning that influence isn't as concentrated in a single area. New York is home to other major cities upstate, but the sheer size of New York City in comparison puts the state in a similar position to Illinois. In fact, out of all the states in the US, Illinois is home to the second largest ratio of population between its largest and second largest cities, after only New York, with Chicago more than 13 times the size of the next most populous city. On top of that, in Illinois' case, its second largest city is a suburb of Chicago. In fact, the next three most populous cities in the state by population in the city limits, Aurora, Joliet, and Naperville, are all Chicago suburbs. On top of that, Chicago sits on the very edge of a pretty long state, meaning much of the state is quite far from the city. Much of southern Illinois, all the way up to the suburbs of St. Louis, for example, is closer to Mississippi, a deep south state that Illinois doesn't even border, to their own state's largest city. And though most of the state is considered part of the Midwest, its southern tip is culturally a mix of southern and Midwestern. This has led to some people from rural Illinois to call for Chicagoland and the rest of Illinois to be split into two different states, and the differences between the city and rural Illinois was by far the thing my Illinois viewers brought up most frequently when I was researching this video. Like all my videos in US Explained, I'm going to try my best to have a balanced approach in the time I spend on both the rural and urban areas of the state, taking into account the state's numerous different regions and large area, as well as the huge population in the city and the outsized role it's played in influencing the history, society, culture, and economy of both the US and the world. But I'm sorry if I focus more or less on different aspects and regions of the state than you prefer. Illinois is located in the eastern part of the central US, in the region known as the Midwest, though the state's southern tip is often considered to be part of the South. Parts of Illinois are also sometimes considered part of the Rust Belt, the region around the Great Lakes that was once the industrial heart of the country, but has dealt with economic decline and outmigration over the last half century. However, Chicago's incredibly diversified economy meant that the city didn't struggle with deindustrialization as much as other Great Lakes cities like Detroit, Cleveland, and Buffalo. It's a population powerhouse. The state is the most populous in the entire Midwest, the country's second most populous region, and Chicago and its suburbs have more people than any other urban area located on the Great Lakes, surpassing even Canada's largest city, Toronto. On top of that, it's the second most populous state not located on the country's coast, though the largest, Pennsylvania, barely surpasses Illinois in population and is only about 30 miles from the ocean in some places, while Illinois is squarely in the country's interior. It borders Wisconsin to the north, Iowa and Missouri to the west, Kentucky to the south, Indiana to the east, and shares a small water border through Lake Michigan with the state of Michigan. The slightly diagonal north-south border cuts 51 miles or 83 kilometers through the lake until it reaches a point where it becomes a horizontal water border with Indiana to the south. At another point in the lake, a mile off the shore of the south side of Chicago, the Illinois-Indiana border turns to a vertical north-south line, making contact with the shore 3.5 miles to the south, dividing the city of Chicago, which it borders, from its suburbs in Indiana, and continuing for another 163 miles or 262 kilometers until it reaches the Wabash River. It then follows the Wabash southwest until it reaches the Ohio River. Across the Ohio sits Kentucky, which owns most of the water in the river at this point. At the southern tip of the state, the Ohio meets the Mississippi in the town of Cairo, Illinois. From Cairo, it follows the Mississippi northwest as the border with Missouri. St. Louis, Missouri's most populous urban area, is right across the Mississippi from Illinois, and a number of suburbs sit on the Illinois side. Across the river from the Illinois town of Warsaw, the Des Moines River flows into the Mississippi and forms the border between Missouri and Iowa. The winding course of the Mississippi forms Illinois' western border, now with Iowa, all the way to the town of East Dubuque, across from the Iowa city of Dubuque, where it leaves the river and moves east in a horizontal line, changing to a border with Wisconsin. Wisconsin sits north of Illinois for the entire length of the two states' 144-mile or 232 kilometer long land border all the way to Lake Michigan, which then continues as a water border for another 40 miles or 64 kilometers out into the lake. It passes through the far northern suburbs of Chicago, and some areas on the Wisconsin side are sometimes considered to be part of the Chicagoland area. Milwaukee is less than 2 hours north of Chicago, and with smaller Wisconsin cities like Kenosha and Racine in between the two, they form a string of urbanization on the southwestern shore of the lake, and you can travel all the way from Milwaukee through Chicago to the suburbs of northwestern Indiana without having spent much time at all in a rural area. Illinois is home to a number of major rivers. The Ohio, Mississippi, and Wabash form its borders, but a number of other large tributaries flow through the state into the Mississippi, such as the Kaskaskia in the south and the Rock in the north. The largest of the state's tributaries, though, is the river it takes its name from, the Illinois. It's formed just outside Chicago where the Kankakee, which flows in from Indiana, meets the Des Plaines, which flows parallel to Lake Michigan just a few miles inland through the suburbs of Chicago. This means that only a tiny sliver of the state's land actually drains into Lake Michigan, with most of even greater Chicago lying in the natural watershed of the Mississippi River, not the lake the city sits on, a strategic location that was essential for the city's growth and success. The Illinois flows southwest down the center of the state until it meets the Mississippi not far outside St. Louis. The state is very flat, by some measures the second flattest in the entire country after just Florida. Northern Illinois lies at a higher elevation, with the state gradually sloping lower towards the south. Other than the areas immediately along rivers and streams, there are only two major parts of the state where the flat topography gives way to larger hills: the Driftless area in the northwestern corner of the state and the Shawnee Hills in Illinois' southern tip. The Driftless area is a region along the Mississippi River spread between Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. Most of the region is located in Wisconsin, but a small section of Illinois around the historic town of Galena is part of it. While glaciers carved out and flattened much of the Midwest, leaving behind flat and fertile soil which helped turn the region into a major agricultural producer, it missed the Driftless area, and the scenic hills, valleys, and small forests of the region leave it looking more like New England than the Midwest. It's a fascinating window into what this famously flat part of the country looked like before glaciation. Charles Mound, the highest point in the state at 1,235 feet, is a small hill in the Driftless area on the Wisconsin border. Located in the northeastern corner of the state on Lake Michigan, Chicago and its suburbs such as Naperville, Evanston, Elgin, Aurora, Schaumburg, and Joliet, to name a few, dominate northern Illinois. Some suburbs like Lake Forest are incredibly wealthy, while others struggle with high poverty. It sprawls through 6 different Illinois counties. Those outside of Cook County, where Chicago is located, are often referred to as the collar counties. The greater Chicago area, not all of which is located in Illinois, is the most populous urban area in the state and the third most populous in the country after just New York City and Los Angeles, home to 8.67 million people in it and its suburbs. On top of its large population, Chicagoland also sprawls across a huge area. At 2,300 square miles, only Greater New York City and Greater Atlanta take up more land, and it's larger than the states of both Rhode Island and Delaware. Because it's so large and because there's such a distinct difference between one of the country's most urbanized cities and its sprawling suburbs, Chicagoans get really picky about whether you live in the city or the suburbs. Typically, if you live in the suburbs of a major city and are traveling, you just tell people you're from the city because odds are they've never heard of your suburb. But people who live in the city limits of Chicago really don't like it when people in the suburbs lay claim to the city, even though, the suburbs wouldn't exist without the city. But it makes sense though. Chicago's seemingly endless suburbs are so different from the city, which is the second most densely populated major city in the country, and so you could very easily live an hour or more from downtown and not really spend much time at all in the city depending on where you are. The region is the economic engine of the state as well as its population center and has had a huge influence on Illinois' growth and development as well as on the US as a whole as one of the country's 3 largest cities. But there's a lot more in northern Illinois outside of Chicago. South of the city along the Kankakee River is Kankakee, home to about 66,000 people in its urban area. In the north central part of the state is Rockford, home to 276,000 people in it and its suburbs. It's the second most populous urban area centered in Illinois and the third most populous in the state overall after Chicago and the suburbs of St. Louis. It sits along the Rock River not far south of the Wisconsin border and is the southern tip of a fairly continuous strand of urbanization stretching along the Rock River north into Beloit and Janesville in Wisconsin. The urban area measurement that I use in these videos includes suburbs, so the drop off from 8.6 million to 276,000 between the state's largest and second largest cities is enormous. Further southwest, on the Mississippi River across from Iowa, sit the cities of Moline and Rock Island, the Illinois portion of an area known as the Quad Cities, along with the Iowa cities of Davenport and Bettendorf. All in all, around 142,000 people live in the Illinois side of the Quad Cities. The flat prairie land, since converted into agriculture outside the cities, continues into central Illinois. It has the 6th largest agricultural production out of the 50 states and ranks 1st in soybean production, 2nd in corn production, 8th in wheat, and 4th by number of pigs, making it an American agricultural giant, an industry that dominates throughout rural north, central, and southern Illinois. A number of smaller cities dot the center of the state. Peoria on the Illinois River is the 4th largest urban area in the state, with 259,000 people in it and its suburbs. Peoria almost forms a triangle with 4 other central Illinois urban areas. The twin cities of Bloomington and Normal are collectively home to 134,000 people, with Normal the location of Illinois State University. They aren't the only Twin City college town in central Illinois. Champaign and Urbana, home to the flagship campus of the University of Illinois, the largest university in the state and the 14th largest in the country, isn't far away. The cities together home to 147,000 people. Nearby Decatur is home to 86,000 people, and Springfield, Illinois' capital city and the home of Abraham Lincoln, is the state's 5th largest urban area with 159,000 people. Other smaller cities in the region include Danville, Galesburg, and Quincy, to name a few. Southern Illinois is culturally and geographically very distinct from the rest of the state. Because Illinois is a long state, over 600 miles north to south, the southern part of the state is at a similar latitude to the southern parts of Missouri, Kentucky, and Virginia, and is less than 100 miles from southern states like Arkansas and Tennessee. The region is, similar to southern Indiana, culturally a mix of the South and Midwest, with different accents, traditions, and ancestry than the northern and even central parts of the state. The region's landscape is dominated by the rocky and forested Shawnee Hills, often called the Illinois Ozarks, which aren't too far from the actual Ozarks across the Mississippi and Missouri, or the hilly landscape of Kentucky across the Ohio River. Covered in forests and large rock formations like the Garden of the Gods, it's a beautiful part of the state that stands out from the rest of Illinois. It's home to large coal deposits, and coal mining is a major part of southern Illinois' economy. In fact, Illinois is the fourth largest producer of coal in the United States, producing more coal than states like Montana, and surpassed by only Wyoming, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania. Its large urban area consists of the suburbs of St. Louis, Missouri's largest urban area and the 22nd largest in the country. Around 519,000 people live in suburban areas of St. Louis and Illinois. The city of East St. Louis, Illinois is right across from the Mississippi from downtown St. Louis, making it closely connected to the city, and other cities like Cahokia, Belleville, Granite City, Collinsville, and Alton make the St. Louis suburbs the second largest urban area in the state. With its wide rivers and ancient earthen pyramids built by Mississippian peoples, such as the Cahokia Mounds, early settlers to southern Illinois dubbed it Little Egypt, or simply the Egypt, and a number of place names in the region were named for places in Egypt, such as Karnak, Thebes, and Cairo. Cairo, not Cairo, has a sad and fascinating story. It sits where the Ohio meets the Mississippi. At the confluence of two of America's greatest rivers, one would be surprised it isn't a major city. Though it was never huge, it was once a city on the rise, propelled by the steamboat shipping industry along the Mississippi and Ohio. At its peak in 1920, it was home to 15,000 people. While it's not much today, back then it was the 8th largest Illinois city outside of Cook County, and was a thriving, bustling river port. As the decades progressed, though, steamboat shipping dwindled on the rivers and new railroads bypassed the city, cutting it off from the trade routes that had been responsible for its growth. At the same time, the city was home to a large black population. About a third of its residents were black, and racist militias formed targeting black people in the city. Lynchings and harassment of Cairo's black population led race relations in the city to deteriorate, while at the same time the economy continued to decline without the steamboat and rail traffic it depended on. Today, the city at the southern tip of Illinois, which once was home to 15,000 people, is down to just 1,600 and shrinking fast. Entire city blocks have become vacant lots, streets are often overgrown, and houses abandoned and collapsing. Alexander County, where Cairo is located, has lost 43% of its population since 2010 alone, a larger population decline than any other county in the entire United States. In 2019 alone, the county's population shrunk by 11%. Population decline is a problem across the entire state, however. Since 2010, only 15 of Illinois' 102 counties experienced population growth at all, and most by less than 1%. The other 87 have all lost more residents than they gained, in many cases at rates of more than 10%. Rural Illinois was impacted particularly hard, with most of Illinois' rural counties losing residents across the state. Urban areas did as well. Springfield, Peoria, and most of the St. Louis suburbs all lost people. Only Urbana-Champaign, Bloomington Normal, and Chicagoland saw growth, and other than in Kendall County, it was all very tepid. Overall, Illinois was one of only 3 states to experience population decline in the last decade, losing 2.75% of its residents, less than West Virginia, but more than Mississippi, the other 2 states which lost population. The COVID-19 pandemic kicked off a domestic migration which is still underway and not entirely understood. There are also very few national trends which hold true across the board with this migration. Despite what politicians and the media say, some red states grew in population and others declined, and vice versa with blue states. Some urban areas gained people, some declined significantly, and same with rural areas. If you want, I might make a video at some point looking at the causes and effects of this ongoing migration, but from what I can best understand, the pandemic and the rise in working from home that it kicked off, which went from less than 5% to 60% during the height of the pandemic but remains at around 30% today, gave people more flexibility in where they want to live and allowed them to take into greater consideration factors besides proximity to the workplace. Because of this, local factors like quality of life, distance to nature and recreation, Taxes, poverty, economic decline, crime, cost of living, and congestion played an increased role in where people moved. While only 3 states lost people over the last decade, in the 3 years since 2020, 17 states and DC have experienced population decline, though as of 2023, the decline is slowing across the board. Illinois, which was already losing people, has continued to be one of the fastest declining states since the pandemic, with a loss of 1.8% of its residents, surpassed by only DC and New York. The difference is that while rural Illinois continues to lose people, Chicago and its suburbs now are too, the city itself shrinking by about 3%. In terms of sheer numbers, only New York City and San Francisco lost more people. Work from home is likely a major reason for this. Across the country, cities have struggled to get workers back into downtown offices as they stay at home or move to other cities or states, leaving other downtown businesses without customers and creating a hole in the center of the city's urban fabric. Chicago's had one of the slowest pandemic recoveries out of any major U.S. city, with 15% vacancy in downtown offices, surpassed by only Houston, Dallas, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C. On top of that, residents of Chicago's south and west sides, which have in many areas suffered from high crime, high poverty, disinvestment by the city, and pollution, are leaving seeking better opportunities elsewhere, many to places like Georgia, Texas, and Florida. Much of the city, though, is growing. New buildings are going up, and downtown neighborhoods like the Loop still feel bustling and busy. While population decline is certainly a problem Illinois will have to deal with, it has the benefit of already being one of the most populous states in the country, as well as having a highly diversified economy, and hopefully things will begin to trend upwards. What is now Illinois was originally home to a number of different indigenous peoples, primarily speakers of Algonquian languages. A political union of a dozen different tribes, including the Peoria, Cahokia, Michigamia, Tamaroa, and Kaskaskia, known as the Illiniwek or Illinois Confederation, controlled much of the region. Siouan-speaking peoples like the Dakota and Ho-Chunk lived in the north, as did peoples like the Potawatomi, Miami, and Kickapoo. The Sauk and Meskwaki lived along the Mississippi River, the Osage lived in the west, and the Shawnee, Chickasaw, and Quapaw in the south. Many native peoples are descendants of an ancient indigenous civilization known as the Mississippians, who lived throughout much of what is now the United States. They built massive earthen pyramids and cities across the Mississippi Valley, and controlled a trade network that stretched across much of the continent. Their largest city, now known as Cahokia, sat along the Mississippi River in what are now the suburbs of St. Louis in Illinois. At Cahokia's peak, it was the largest city on the continent north of Mexico, and one of the largest in the world, surpassing at the time cities like London and Paris. Today, large earthen mounds, remnants of ancient pyramids, are preserved as Cahokia Mounds, a state historic site as well as UNESCO World Heritage Site. As European colonists arrived in North America, they brought with them diseases such as smallpox, which the native people of the continent had not been exposed to, and as such had little immunity. Disease decimated the continent's indigenous population, killing 90% of them, and those that survived often died at the hands of colonists, as Europeans expanded their settlement westward. Additionally, the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy, based in upstate New York, invaded and pushed out many native tribes all the way to what is today Illinois, to gain control of land for fur trapping, in a conflict known as the Beaver Wars. Many of Illinois' indigenous peoples were pushed out of the state into places further west like Iowa, Kansas, and Oklahoma, as wars and treaties opened the region for settlers. The flat plain south of the Great Lakes where Illinois is located was a prime migration route from the east, and many native peoples such as the Lenape, Waya, Wyandot, Shawnee, and others settled in or passed through Illinois as they fled west from their homelands in the eastern U.S. and Canada. The first Europeans to colonize the region were the French. French-Canadian explorer Louis Joliet and Jesuit missionary Jacques Marquette traveled up the Mississippi and then Illinois rivers in 1673, claiming the land for France and founding a mission at a beautiful spot along the Illinois called Starved Rock. French colonization continued with another Jesuit missionary, René Robert Cavelier Sieur de la Salle, who founded a mission in fort called Fort Crèvecoeur on the Illinois. It would later become the city of Peoria. French settlers founded cities along the Mississippi, like Kaskaskia and Cahokia, near the ancient Mississippian city, which was founded decades before St. Louis, which it's today a suburb of. New France stretched from the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. It was split into 5 colonies that developed distinct societies and cultures: Newfoundland, Hudson's Bay, Acadia around the Gulf of St. Lawrence and Bay of Fundy, Louisiana on the southern reaches of the Mississippi River, and Canada along the St. Lawrence River. The area around the upper reaches of the Mississippi and the Great Lakes was mostly home to native people. The few French forts and settlements were primarily to control the fur trade with the region's Native Americans, and French settlers in the region generally had good relationships with its native people, with indigenous Americans and French settlers often marrying and starting families with one another. Most of the French settlers had migrated there from Canada, although some came north from New Orleans. On the fringes of the empire, originally it was governed as part of Canada and then later Louisiana, and was referred to as either Upper Louisiana or the Illinois country, for the river and the native people who lived there. As British colonies in the Atlantic coast spread westward, clashing with French control of the continent's interior, war broke out between the two empires. A global conflict, its North American theater was called the French and Indian War, and saw Britain fight France and its ally Spain from 1754 to 1763, with different native tribes allied with each side. Britain won, and as part of the Treaty of Paris, which ended the war, gained control of all the French lands north of the Ohio and west of the Mississippi, including the Illinois country, where it became part of a new British province called Quebec, stretching from the Mississippi all the way to the Gulf of St. Lawrence. It wasn't a part of Britain for long, however. The Revolutionary War broke out in 1775 between Britain and 13 of their colonies on the Atlantic coast, which soon declared independence. In 1783, the American colonies came out victorious. Another Treaty of Paris, this one establishing the new United States of America, was signed in 1783, and as part of the agreement, Britain gave up not just the 13 colonies, but their land all the way to the Mississippi River and as far north as the Great Lakes. Though briefly claimed by Virginia, the vast, sparsely populated lands between the Ohio, Mississippi, and Great Lakes, the modern Midwest, were set aside in 1784 as the Northwest Territory. Most of this land, though, was only controlled by the U.S. on paper, and many of the native tribes who lived there wanted nothing to do with the new country. Throughout the late 1700s and early 1800s, the U.S. waged war with various confederations of native peoples for control of the Northwest Territory, pushing their way into the territory and forcing the native people who lived there further west. As they were pushed out, American settlers moved in, and as the territory's population grew, it was broken up into various new territories, which later became states. In 1800, the Northwest Territory was split in two down the lower peninsula of Michigan to the Ohio River. The western section, which the Illinois country was part of, became known as the Indiana Territory. In 1809, it was divided again, with much of what is now Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota becoming a new territory called the Illinois Territory. By the late 1810s, enough settlers had moved into the southern half of the territory to admit it as a new state. Initially, its northern border was to be at the same latitude as Indiana's, but a delegate to the House of Representatives from Illinois, named Nathaniel Pope, successfully got it pushed 51 miles north. He figured that control of this northern strip, which was the best location for a canal between the watersheds of the Great Lakes and Mississippi, would help Illinois grow as a center of commerce and trade. Pope's prediction was proven to be spot on, and he's the reason America's third largest city is in Illinois and not Wisconsin. On December 3, 1818, Illinois was admitted to the Union as the 21st state. Slavery existed in Illinois, as it did in most of the country, but it was never as prominent as in the southern U.S. No new enslaved people were allowed to be brought into the state, and it was fully abolished in 1848, though it existed in practice until the Civil War. Illinois' original capital was Kaskaskia, which had been the French colonial and later territorial capital. It was then located in a town called Vandalia until 1837, when a young state representative named Abraham Lincoln successfully pushed for it to be moved to the more central location of Springfield, where it's been ever since. Easy to settle, home to fertile land for agriculture, and providing an easy land route west between the hills and mountains south of the Ohio River and the Great Lakes to the north, Illinois grew quickly in the early decades of statehood, especially following the Black Hawk War in 1832, in which most of the state's remaining native population was forced out. The Ohio River provided an easy path west by boat, while the Mississippi and Illinois rivers allowed ship access to the interior of the state. Most of the initial settlers were descendants of settlers from England, Ireland, and Scotland, as well as the Scots-Irish, a people whose ancestors had moved to Northern Ireland from Scotland and Northern England as part of English colonization of Ireland. They primarily moved north into southern Illinois from Kentucky and other parts of the South, much of the reason southern Illinois has retained a partially southern character, and some descendants of German immigrants moved west from Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana. Agriculture in the region was made significantly easier after a man named John Deere, who'd moved to Illinois from Vermont, invented a popular steel plow, and Cyrus McCormick, who'd moved there from Virginia, a popular harvester, both of which resulted in even more people moving west into the state with the hopes of owning their own farm. Immigrants poured in from Sweden, Canada, the British Isles, and especially Germany, which was dealing with wars and unrest. Today, German Americans make up the largest ancestry group in the state and the country, as well as the largest in most Illinois counties, with 17.5% of Illinoisans tracing their ancestry at least in part to Germany. Another group that migrated to Illinois were followers of a religious movement from upstate New York known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or LDS Church, whose members are often referred to as Mormons. Though they'd initially moved from New York to the city of Independence, Missouri, they were forced out following an armed conflict with non-Mormon locals known as the Mormon War. They fled east to Illinois, where they settled in a city called Nauvoo along the Mississippi River. At the same time, most Mormons lived in Nauvoo, including the movement's founder, Joseph Smith, and the city, which was at the time almost one and the same with the church, became the largest in the state. Other Illinoisans grew suspicious of and hostile to the Mormons in Nauvoo and viewed the city as being essentially a theocracy. In 1844, Joseph Smith was arrested and imprisoned in the nearby town of Carthage, and an armed mob attacked the jail and assassinated him. Following his killing, chaos broke loose. Vigilante groups hunted down LDS members, and armed conflict broke out once more. Lacking clear leadership, the church splintered into several groups, but the main branch, what became today's LDS Church, were those led by a man named Brigham Young. They abandoned Nauvoo, fleeing Illinois and eventually settling in Utah, where today members of the LDS Church make up the majority of the state's population. When Illinois became a state in 1818, it was one of the least populated in the country. Only 36,000 people lived there. Just 4 decades later, in 1860, it was home to 1.7 million and was the country's 4th most populous state, surpassed by only New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, and it would rise to 3rd not long after. Though its population was initially centered in the south of the state, it was the rapid rise of Chicago, which was only officially incorporated in 1833 but would quickly become the largest city in the state, that would drive Illinois' growth from then on. Native Americans and later French traders had long used what became known as the Chicago Portage to travel between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River. As the Des Plaines River, whose waters feed into the Illinois and then Mississippi, flows parallel to Lake Michigan just a few miles away, the watershed of the Great Lakes becomes incredibly thin in northeastern Illinois. A small, swampy river called the Chicago River, which formed from 2 branches, flowed into Lake Michigan, and the headwaters of its south branch, called Mud Lake, was just 6 miles from the Des Plaines. This gave this little river incredible strategic value. Cargo could be brought from the Great Lakes up the Chicago River, unloaded and transported a short distance by land, and from the Des Plaines could move anywhere along the Mississippi River and its tributaries. It was by far the easiest route between the watersheds of the St. Lawrence and Mississippi rivers, and control of it was essential. The first settler in what would become the city of Chicago was a black trader named Jean-Baptiste Point du Sable, who is considered to be the city's founder. The U.S. built a fort along the river near du Sable's trading post called Fort Dearborn, and a town named for the river began to grow at the spot where the river meets the lake. As trade on the portage helped turn Chicago into a fast-growing small city, it was helped even more by the creation of a canal along the portage connecting the 2 waterways. So right here in downtown Chicago, just across the street over there was Fort Dearborn, and that was established in the 1800s by the United States to safeguard control of this passage between Lake Michigan over there and the Des Plaines River, and with that the control of the Mississippi watershed further west. And the Chicago naturally flowed into Lake Michigan, and so it was an important portage where people would send boats, ships, trade and transportation would all cross through the river over there and connect. It was because it was the closest point of connection between the watershed of the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence and the Mississippi. The Illinois and Michigan Canal opened in 1848, and the town at the river's mouth quickly became a major port city. At the time, the fastest growing city in the world. In the years leading up to the Civil War, Illinois had grown into one of the most populous states in the country, and its influence would soon be personified in a number of major political figures from the state rising to national prominence in the era. Slavery had become a contentious national issue, especially as new western states were being admitted to the Union. Stephen Douglas, a Democratic senator from Illinois, was a well-known and influential senator. In 1858, he was running for re-election and was being challenged by Abraham Lincoln. a little-known lawyer whose only political experience had been a single term in the House of Representatives 10 years before. Lincoln was running as a member of the Republican Party, a new, more anti-slavery party that had only been founded 4 years prior and had yet to win a presidential election. But debates between the two across the state over the issue of slavery, which Lincoln believed should not be expanded into the West while Douglas believed the states should be able to decide, saw him become a national figure, and though he lost the race for the Senate, become popular enough to defeat Douglas and a Democratic Party divided into northern and southern factions 2 years later in the 1860 presidential election. The election of this lawyer from Springfield saw 11 southern states secede and form the Confederacy, causing the Civil War. Illinois remained with the Union, and Lincoln would lead the country to victory before his assassination. The general who oversaw the Confederacy's defeat, Ulysses S. Grant, was another Illinoisan who would later win the presidency himself. Following the war, Illinois continued to grow. Grain, cattle, iron, and timber from the Midwest could be shipped to Chicago via the canal, processed in city mills and factories, and shipped to eastern harbors through the Erie Canal in New York City. Already the main shipping center of the country's interior, its central location and existing importance in trade and transportation brought numerous railroads to the city. It quickly became the country's undisputed rail hub, a position it still holds today. Most Amtrak routes start or end in the city, and it's the main hub for cargo rail on the continent, allowing access to North America's two most prominent waterways and acting as a centralized location where rail lines could extend north, south, east, and west. With so much rail and shipping, factories developed throughout the city to process and manufacture goods to then be shipped elsewhere. Cattle and hogs from the west were shipped into the city by rail, held and slaughtered at the Union stockyards, the largest stockyards in the world, processed in Chicago factories, and shipped across the globe. For a long time, the city was the largest meatpacking center on earth. Immigrants poured in to work these jobs from countries like Ireland, Poland, Italy, Russia, Sweden, Greece, Ukraine, Czechia, and so on. And many of these immigrants were Jewish. Illinois has by sheer numbers more Polish Americans than any other state, and 1.9 million people in the greater Chicago area are of Polish descent, nearly 10% of the global Polish diaspora, and more than any other city outside Poland. All these different immigrant groups went on to influence the city and state significantly. Jane Addams founded the Hull House in the city to help immigrants move out of poverty. Chicago had been growing rapidly. Built on a swamp, many of its early buildings were made of wood, and they even raised the entire city up a level to prevent flooding. One of the most fascinating things about Chicago is that there are multiple layers to the city. You can see right now we're up in this top layer where the street level is, but then there's 1, 2 more underneath us. Now, if you're downtown crossing over the Chicago River, you might see that the river is actually pretty far beneath you. But this isn't actually where the city originally was. It's a naturally very low-lying, flat area, and the city was built on a swamp. So that means that there was, back in the day, a lot of flooding, lots of mud on the roads, and the whole thing was very hard to maintain. So in the 1850s and 1860s, they actually raised the whole city up almost an entire story. And because of that, the whole city sits almost on this artificial level that wasn't originally there. Most of the streets that you see today are on this higher upper level, whereas through traffic, people who are just passing through the city might take these lower levels where you have wider, larger streets, underground parking lots, and loading docks. So the city does a pretty good job covering this up, but it makes for this really interesting element to the city. Another layer to the city is the pedway. So Chicago gets very cold in the winter, so they built a series of underground pedestrian tunnels that run all throughout the city and allow you to access lower floors of businesses in downtown Chicago. And some businesses are even exclusively located in the pedway. It's a pretty cool element to Chicago that not too many people know about. In 1871, a barn fire spread across the entire center of the city, burning a third of Chicago to the ground, killing over 300 people, and leaving 100,000 people, a third of its population, homeless. This could have spelled the end for Chicago, but a strong response allowed it to recover and rebuild quickly. At the same time, engineering technology was improving rapidly. The Bessemer process made steel manufacturing significantly easier, which, coupled with safer elevators, allowed the construction of taller buildings than ever before. Chicago, with an entire city center to rebuild, embraced this new technology and invented the skyscraper. The city's home life insurance building became the first skyscraper in the world, and many more followed, turning it into the proving ground for new styles of architecture and new heights that it still is today. In 1893, the newly rebuilt city, now the second largest in the country, hosted the World's Columbian Exposition to show off its recovery. It would remain the second largest city in the United States for the next 100 years, when it was overtaken in 1990 by Los Angeles. Chicago had grown so large that Lake Michigan, where it got its drinking water from, had become highly polluted, and so the city dug a new canal between the Chicago River and the Des Plaines, the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, that reversed the flow of the river entirely. Lake Michigan ever since has partially drained into the Mississippi, a move that cleaned up the lake but affected downstream states and allowed invasive species to move between the two watersheds. Another canal which connected the Des Plaines to the Calumet River in the south side shifted Chicago's port away from downtown, and major ship traffic has since moved through this newer route. During Prohibition, organized crime flourished in the city, with Al Capone establishing operations there and gaining national notoriety. Political corruption is still a major problem in the city and state today. In 1908, Springfield was the site of a brutal massacre, in which a white mob attacked and murdered black residents in the city and destroyed businesses owned by black residents. The NAACP was founded in response. Illinois was the largest destination for migrants during the Great Migration. During the World Wars and in the decades following, black Southerners fleeing racial discrimination and poor economic prospects in the South, as well as an exploitative system of labor known as sharecropping, headed to northern cities where new jobs were opening up during the war. Chicago was among the most popular destinations, as a huge city with a large manufacturing economy and a national rail hub, which made it easier to access. Many migrants to the city moved there from states directly south of Illinois, such as Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, and Alabama. While a number of northern states saw their black populations grow during the Great Migration, none did more than Illinois. In 1900, only 1.8% of Illinoisans were black. By 1980, that number was up to 14.7%. Only Washington, D.C. saw its black population grow more during that time period. Many moved to the south side of the city, where most of the manufacturing and industrial jobs were. In subsequent decades, the majority black neighborhood faced de facto segregation, redlining, white flight, gentrification, disinvestment from the city, and pollution from nearby factories and industrial areas. This has led to issues of poverty in many parts of the south side, which in turn led to high crime and violence. Illinois played a major role in the creation of the nuclear bomb and nuclear energy. The first ever self-sustaining nuclear reactor was built in a secret experiment under the bleachers of a squash court at the University of Chicago in 1942. Today, Illinois produces more nuclear power than any other state. The laissez-faire free market economic theory, which has dominated American economic thought for the last few decades, is often known as the Chicago School of Economics, as it was popularized in large part by University of Chicago professors like Milton Friedman. In 1933, Chicago's mayor Anton Cermak was assassinated in Miami by a killer who was trying to shoot President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The city's had a number of influential mayors. The Daley dynasty dominated Chicago politics for decades. Richard J. Daley and his son Richard M. Daley both served as mayor for a total of 43 years. Harold Washington, elected in 1983, was the city's first black mayor. 1968 saw a number of riots in the city, both after the assassination of Martin Luther King and at the Democratic National Convention, where police and anti-Vietnam War protesters clashed in the city. Basketball legend Michael Jordan, who helped bring the sport to global prominence and is considered one of, if not the greatest basketball players of all time, did so while playing for the Chicago Bulls in the 1990s. Ray Kroc from the Chicago suburb of Oak Park opened in Des Plaines, Illinois, the first franchise of a small hamburger restaurant from California called McDonald's. He took ownership of the restaurant and expanded it into the largest fast food chain in the world, with its headquarters long in the Chicago suburb of Oak Brook and now in the city itself. Long one of the world's best skyscraper cities, Chicago was home to the tallest building in the world for over 2 decades. From its construction in 1973 until it was surpassed in 1998 by the construction of the Petronas Towers, Chicago's iconic Sears Tower, now officially called the Willis Tower, was the tallest building on Earth. In the last century, only the Empire State Building held that title for longer, and today it remains the 3rd tallest building in the US. In 2008, Illinois Senator Barack Obama was elected president, becoming the country's first ever black president. Chicago is Illinois' only major city, and is the 3rd largest in the country however you spin it, whether you're looking at city limits, urban areas, or metro areas. Its urban area, which includes its suburbs, is home to 8.67 million people. That gives it a larger population than 37 different states, more people than live in states like Washington, Tennessee, Arizona, and Massachusetts. It's hard to overstate just how huge Chicago is. It's the 46th most populous urban area in the entire world, making it a city of real global significance and influence. Nicknames like Chi-Town and the Windy City are well known everywhere. More people live in Chicago and its suburbs than live in the urban areas of major world cities like Hong Kong, Madrid, St. Petersburg, Singapore, and Toronto. It's the largest U.S. city in the Midwest, the largest on a Great Lake, the largest between the Atlantic and Pacific coasts, and after Mexico City, the second largest inland city on the continent. The birthplace of the skyscraper, today Chicago has 135 skyscrapers, the 10th most of any city on the planet, and surpassing the United States and Western Hemisphere overall by only New York City. The US city with the third most, Miami, has 58, putting Chicago at a tier above any other American city besides New York for skyscraper building. All of the 13 tallest buildings in the country, in fact, are either in New York City or Chicago. The city was at the forefront of a number of architectural movements, including Art Deco and modern architecture. So I'm on top of Marina City. This was once, when it was completed, the tallest residential building in the world. Not anymore. It was meant to be a city within a city, to have all the amenities people need to go about their day-to-day lives. And they're sometimes nicknamed the corn cobs because they look almost like corn cobs with their balconies going around each of the sides. And as you can see, Chicago is just this architectural playground filled with beautiful buildings and skyscrapers. You got everything from Sears Tower over there to the Hancock Building over there. And there's tons of new buildings always going up and sort of changing the way we think about architecture. Famed architect Frank Lloyd Wright did much of his work out of his studio in suburban Oak Park, and world-renowned skyscraper architecture firm Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, which built, among other things, the Burj Khalifa, is based in the city. The Sears Tower was long the tallest building in the world, and along with Trump Tower is among the 10 tallest buildings in the country. The St. Regis is the tallest building designed by a woman in the world, and the city is home to a number of other iconic skyscrapers, like the Aon Center, John Hancock Center, Aqua, Lake Point Tower, Marina City, and beautiful older buildings like the Tribune Tower, Wrigley Building, the Jewelers Building, Carbide and Carbon Building, and Merchandise Mart, which uses the world's largest projector to project a beautiful light show in the building, which is the world's largest permanent digital art exhibit. So Chicago is an architectural playground and laboratory where a lot of new building styles and designs have been tested out and built throughout history. It's also home to some of the tallest buildings in the United States. Over here we have the Aon Center, which is the 4th tallest building in the city. Over here is the St. Regis, is the 3rd. Everyone calls it the Sears Tower still. It's what its name was for a long time, but it's technically now called the Willis Tower. The Sears Tower was once the tallest building in the whole world, but it still remains the tallest building in the city and one of the tallest buildings in the United States today. There's also really cool designs like the Aqua Tower right there. The Aqua obviously resembles water. And there's a number of other really interesting and iconic buildings throughout Chicago. It's surpassed in population in the US by only New York City and Los Angeles, and is the only American city I've been to that feels most comparable to New York in terms of feeling bustling and vibrant. Los Angeles is bigger, but with a much smaller downtown and fewer pedestrians, it doesn't feel that way. Walking around in Chicago, you're surrounded by enormous skyscrapers as far as the eye can see, and the streets are usually packed with people. The Chicago Board of Trade and Chicago Mercantile Exchange, which merged in 2007, have played a major role in global finance, and the city is one of 12 around the country home to a Federal Reserve Bank, which actually offers a pretty cool guided tour. A major rail hub, Chicago's Union Station is the busiest passenger train station in the country outside of New York, and the L, the city's often elevated transit system, is well known and popular. Chicago is the 5th highest rate of public transit ridership of any major US city. The loop that the L takes around much of the city's downtown has given its name to the downtown neighborhood inside it. The city's home to the iconic Chicago Theater, Navy Pier, a really well done riverwalk with walkways lined by restaurants and bars. Now the Riverwalk itself was redeveloped throughout the course of the last 2 decades, and it's become this big pedestrian park that's really opened up the center of the city to pedestrian traffic. You have a lot of bars, restaurants, playgrounds, and it's an area where a lot of tourists go and everything, but a really nice way to see all the buildings in the city too, right along the Chicago River in the heart of downtown. And the Magnificent Mile, a famous shopping district. The Chicago River is the heart of the city and is crisscrossed with bridges that can lift up if boats pass under. The city dyes the river green every St. Patrick's Day, which is a real sight to see. The park complex, home to Millennium Park, Grant Park, and others, is a great green space in the city's downtown. Home to the Buckingham Fountain, famous sculpture Cloudgate, better known as just the Bean, the Frank Gehry designed J. Pritzker Pavilion, and Lollapalooza, one of the largest annual music festivals in the country, which typically gets around 400,000 attendees. So Chicago's got a string of pretty iconic parks. You have Millennium Park, Grant Park, Maggie Daley Park, and others that make up this pretty continuous stretch of parks that go through a lot of downtown. Behind me, you've got the Michigan Avenue Street Wall, which is a historic collection of older buildings. This really beautiful area that, cut off by the park, makes this almost wall-looking part of the city.
A lot of these parks are built on top of an old rail yard. The Lollapalooza music festival's here. You've definitely heard of the Bean, technically called Cloud Gate. This big bean-shaped metal sculpture that a lot of tourists go to. These parks have a lot of things for people to do in the city. They're right up on the lake shore too on the other side, and are a really nice green space for the people of Chicago.
The city has some of the best museums in the country, such as the Art Institute of Chicago, and institutions at the museum campus like the Field Museum, an enormous natural history museum, the Shedd Aquarium, and the Adler Planetarium. Movies like Blues Brothers, The Untouchables, and Ferris Bueller's Day Off are iconic representations of the city. One of my favorite movies, Home Alone, is filmed in the suburbs. Though its manufacturing sector suffered from the decline of the Rust Belt, Chicago didn't take as hard of a hit, as the city was never fully dependent on manufacturing. It has the most diversified economy of any major city in the United States, with major financial, agricultural, aerospace, transportation, technology, and food production sectors.
Chicago has the most diversified economy of any major city in the US. And because of that, it isn't always lumped in with the Rust Belt because it hasn't had that same degree of dependence on an industrialized economy. However, once you leave downtown Chicago, you start to see old relics of industry as well. Here we've got an old lift bridge, a paper company, and other lift bridges further along the Chicago River, some of which are no longer functional and in need of repairs. You hear trains going by. Once you leave downtown Chicago, it becomes clear that the city does have a very strong and very important industrial history, which is, like many other parts of the Rust Belt, struggling to recover.
Many Chicagoans have a distinct accent, and the city's culture has been largely influenced by both international immigration as well as internal migration from other parts of the US. It's played a major role in global music. The house and drill genres both came out of the city, and it had a large influence on the rock and roll as well as hip-hop scenes. Black migrants from the South brought many of these genres to the city, including blues, jazz, and soul, which developed unique styles in the city. In the 1800s and early 1900s, immigrants from Ireland, Eastern Europe, and Southern Europe flocked to the city. In recent decades, immigration and migration has continued, and Chicago now has major populations of residents from or with ancestry from Mexico, Puerto Rico, China, India, Pakistan, Korea, Vietnam, and Nigeria, just to name a few, as well as the largest populations of Assyrians and Palestinians in the country. And it's home to one of the largest Chinatowns in the US, and is home to unique neighborhoods like the Loop, Pilsen, Lincoln Park, Old Town, Hyde Park, Fulton Market, and River North, just to name a few. It's produced some iconic local foods like the Chicago dog, a poppy seed bun hot dog loaded with toppings like mustard, tomatoes, pickles, onions, and peppers, and sandwiches like the Italian beef and Maxwell Street Polish. Of course, there's Chicago-style pizza, a famous deep dish that's led to rivalry with New York City over whose pizza is better. Local chains like Potbelly and Portillo's are popular, and Italian and Eastern European immigrants have had a major influence in the city's food scene. Of course, I need to talk about crime because it's something that unfortunately a lot of people bring up about Chicago. Of course, there are realities to this, but the perception that Chicago is extraordinarily unsafe is more the result of media fear-mongering than anything else. Most of this comes from the fact that Chicago for the last few years has had the most murders of any city in the US. This is a sad reality, but it's also true that Chicago has far more people than most other US cities. Of course, you'd expect a city with more people to have more murders. Because of this, it's really only a useful statistic if you're comparing it to cities of a similar size. So all this really tells you is that Chicago is more dangerous than New York and LA. If you look at the actual murder rate, Chicago isn't even in the top 10 of major US cities. It's 14th. If you look at the total crime rate, it's 44th. Crime rate is also just a pretty bad comparative statistic because some cities are much more suburban in their layout than others. I recommend you watch City Nerd's video on that if you're interested in learning more. On top of that, crime is mostly concentrated in the south and west sides of the city, areas that struggle with pretty severe poverty. It's a major problem for those who live there, and the disinvestment those neighborhoods have dealt with is an issue the city and state need to put a lot of work into addressing. What that means though is that if you visit Chicago, there are plenty of areas that are very safe, and those are usually the areas that most people visit. Living in a city, everyone is close together, and so even if the chances of you personally being victim to a crime are still fairly low, hearing gunshots and sirens in your neighborhood can be a jarring experience, and for those who are victims of crimes, it's very, very real. Like any big city, there are some areas of Chicago that are safer than others, and it's important to pay attention and keep your wits about you. And though the city certainly has areas that can be quite dangerous and that I wouldn't recommend visiting, it is in no way out of the ordinary as American cities go. Illinois is the 8th highest income inequality of any U.S. state. The state is the most similar to the United States as a whole in terms of its racial demographics. 61% of Illinoisans are white, 17% are Latino, the 10th highest rate in the country and the 4th outside the western U.S., 14% are black, the 4th highest rate outside the South, 5% are Asian, and 2% are multiracial, nearly identical proportions to the country as a whole. Because of this, as well as the fact that the state contains a mixed economy and a landscape containing a major city, a number of smaller cities, and many small towns, natural areas, as well as vast expanses of productive agricultural land, it's often considered a perfect microcosm of the United States as a whole. Overall, Illinois is quite a religiously diverse state. Most Illinoisans, 71%, are Christian. The majority are Protestant, mostly Methodists and Southern Baptists, and though Catholics don't make up a plurality of Christians in Illinois, it is the 8th highest percentage of Catholics of any state. 3.7% of Illinoisans are Muslim, the highest rate of any state in the U.S. 2.3% of Illinoisans are Jewish, the 10th highest rate of any state. While it's the 14th most spoken language in the U.S. overall, thanks to Illinois' Polish heritage, Polish is the 3rd most spoken language in the state, with 1.6% of the population speaking it at home. Illinois hosts a lot of great festivals and events. There's the State Fair in Springfield, the St. Patrick's Day Parade in Chicago, one of the largest in the country, and of course I need to talk about the Superman celebration. Metropolis, a small town on the Ohio River in southern Illinois, has the same name as Superman's hometown, and has gone all in on it. They built a Superman as well as Lois Lane statue. Their newspaper is called the Metropolis Planet. They host a Superman celebration every year, and the state legislature officially declared them to be Superman's hometown. The most widely circulated newspaper in the state and the 8th most circulated in the country is the Chicago Tribune. It's home to a number of major universities. The largest is the flagship campus of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, followed by the University of Illinois at Chicago. Chicago is also home to DeVry, DePaul, and the University of Chicago. Normal is home to Illinois State, and Northwestern is located in the northern suburb of Evanston, just to name a few. Illinois is home to major companies like McDonald's, Boeing, Walgreens, Kraft Heinz, Orbitz, Grubhub, Mondelez, Jewel-Osco, Hyatt, Sears, John Deere, State Farm, Allstate, Ulta Beauty, Cook Foods, Motorola, BMO Harris, and Caterpillar. Its 2 busiest airports, O'Hare and Midway, are both in Chicago, and are the 4th and 26th busiest in the country, respectively. O'Hare is also the 4th busiest in terms of cargo as well. Its busiest ports are the Port of St. Louis and East St. Louis, the Mid-America Port on the Mississippi River, and the Illinois waterways connecting the Great Lakes to the Mississippi through Chicago. Illinois has at least one major league sports team in each of the 5 most popular professional sports, all located in Chicago. It's one of just a few cities in the country to have 2 baseball teams, the Cubs and the White Sox, which play in Wrigley Field and Guaranteed Rate Field on the north and south sides of the city, respectively. The Cubs have a much wider fan base in the state, whereas the White Sox are more popular in the south side of Chicago and the city's southern suburbs. The NFL's Chicago Bears play in Soldier Field, as does the MLS's Chicago Fire FC, and the NBA's Chicago Bulls, along with the NHL's Chicago Blackhawks, play at the United Center. It's important to keep in mind, though, that these Chicago-based teams aren't as popular in the south of the state. Most of southern Illinois tends to root for St. Louis-based teams. Many famous people were either born in or lived in Illinois, including Betty White, Miles Davis, Bob Odenkirk, Bernie Mac, Vince Vaughn, Chance the Rapper, Dwayne Wade, Jennifer Hudson, Chief Keef, Walt Disney, Al Capone, Juice WRLD, Carl Sandburg, Nick Offerman, Bill Murray, Oscar Mayer, Megyn Kelly, Raquel Welch, Harrison Ford, Robin Williams, Michelle Obama, Richard Pryor, John Belushi, William Wrigley, Kanye West, Gene Hackman, Ludacris, Cindy Crawford, King Von, Seth Meyers, Hugh Hefner, Ray Kroc, Mr. T, John C. Reilly, Polo G, Michael Pena, Christopher Nolan, Chris Wallace, and Soulja Boy. I hope I didn't forget anyone. I don't know how I could have. That was like 40 people, but I digress. Illinois has produced 4 U.S. presidents, all of whom were very influential either in their presidency or outside of it. Abraham Lincoln, who led the country to victory in the Civil War and abolished slavery, and is widely considered the greatest president of all time, was born in Kentucky but moved to central Illinois when he was 21, and built his political career out of the state, living in New Salem and then Springfield, serving in the Illinois State House and then representing the state in the House of Representatives, before losing a race for the Senate and then winning the presidency. Ulysses S. Grant, who led the Union Army during the Civil War and later won the White House, was born in Ohio but lived most of his adult life in the driftless area town of Galena. Ronald Reagan, who helped negotiate an end to the Cold War and popularized a conservative politics on social and economic issues that would go on to dominate the Republican Party for decades, was born in the northern Illinois town of Tampico and lived in various towns in northern and central Illinois until he was 21, eventually moving to California where he built his political career. Most recently, Barack Obama, the country's first black president, was born in Hawaii but moved to Chicago when he was 24, becoming a community organizer in the South Side and then a professor at the University of Chicago. He went on to serve in the Illinois State Senate and then represented Illinois in the U.S. Senate before winning the presidency in 2008. Hillary Clinton, the Democratic nominee for president in 2016, built her political career out of Arkansas and New York, but was born in Chicago and grew up in the city's suburbs. Politically, the state is pretty liberal and strongly favors the Democratic Party. The Cook Partisan Voting Index rates it D+7, which means that in a given year, the Democratic Party performs about 7% better in Illinois than in the country on average. This is mostly due to the influence of Chicago and its suburbs. Most of the other cities are fairly competitive, and rural Illinois tends to be much more conservative. The city of Chicago remains a bastion of machine politics, and corruption is a major issue in the state. In the last few decades, 4 governors and 6 members of Congress, politicians of both parties, have been convicted of crimes, such as Governor Rod Blagojevich, who infamously tried to sell a Senate seat. Out of Illinois' 17 members of Congress, 14 are Democrats and 3 are Republicans. Both of its senators, Tammy Duckworth and Dick Durbin, who is the Senate Majority Whip, is one of the highest ranked members of the Senate, are Democrats, as is the state's governor, J.B. Pritzker. That's it for Illinois. I want to give a big thank you to everyone who has already joined my Patreon. Through it, you can access different things such as monthly maps, an exclusive Discord Q&A with me, quarterly channel newsletters, previews of each thumbnail, and shoutouts to my videos such as these. Please be sure to check out the TII store, where you'll be able to purchase all sorts of official That Is Interesting products and merchandise, including shirts, hoodies, embroidered beanies, masks, mugs, embroidered backpacks, laptop stickers and sleeves, and so on. Also, please subscribe to my brother's channel, Quinn the Cameraman. He put a ton of work into editing this incredibly long video and made the great intro at the beginning of it that I use in all the US Explained videos, so go show him some support. It took you an hour to get this far watching it, just imagine how long it took him to record it, so thank you, Quinn. I appreciate you, man. I tried to be pretty thorough with this video, but I know there were definitely things that I missed as there was a lot to talk about. I want to give a big thank you to everyone from Illinois who helped give me information for this video, leaving detailed and informative comments on YouTube as well as Discord. I truly would not have been able to make this video without all your help. My next video in the series will be on Alabama. I've never been there, so I'll need a lot of help. If you're from Alabama, please respond to my community post or my comment here, or leave something in the Discord server to let me know what you'd like to see included about your home state. I really appreciate the well over 900 of you who have already joined my Discord server. If you haven't joined the Discord server yet, it's a great place to continue conversations about the topics discussed in these videos, interact with fellow viewers, and help provide information about upcoming states in the series. It's a great community, and we do fun stuff like geography game nights, live podcasts, and so on. I'll put links to both the Patreon and the Discord in the description. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you learned something new. Subscribe for more content like this. I cover the countries, cities, people, and places of the world and beyond. These videos will leave you saying, "That is interesting."